Anyway, yesterday was the farmers' demonstration in London, and Brian and I attended. Rachel Mathews was there, one of the speakers at the UK Column event in Bristol last month, and took this picture. Probably between 10 and 20,000 people attended. That was sort of the figures that we heard on the day. Not enough, I think, of the general public there that in support. Vast majority of people from the farming community itself. No question, a great, fantastic group of people that were there with the right intentions. Their only interest is in continuing their passion, which is growing food for us all. Now, there was supposed to be a procession or a march to Parliament Square and back that, and the event was cancelled. But there was a march of a type, which I guess is the 1,800 people from the National Farmers Union that were going to speak to MPs in Parliament. So they left before the speakers spoke on the podium just a few minutes after this. Now, the location itself was kind of problematic because it was quite constrained. So 10 or 20,000 people in that space was extremely tricky. People couldn't move. There was no way to get through or round to other areas and so on. And also half the crowd could not actually see the speakers. But nonetheless, it was a good turnout as far as it went. Now, having said all that, you know, the sort of negatives around it, it was generally a very positive day. I've got to say well done to the organisers for this first event. I hope to see much more. Hopefully this is just the beginning of a journey. Now we'll talk about the actual presentations in a minute. Many of the farmers, well, let's have a look at the tractors first of all. There were a couple of tractors brought into the centre of London, but many of the farmers brought in food, and that food was all going to food banks. Which I thought was a fantastic gesture. It also makes the point, of course, about what this was all about, which is food production, and that is something that, in general, people seem to have forgotten. Now, the people speaking on the podium itself, that was slightly another matter. So let's start off here with a couple of comments from David Kurten, because David Kurten from the Heritage Party was there as well. Let's just listen to him for a second, and then I'll add some comments after this.
But reflecting on this, I'm a little bit in two minds about the protest, not the people protesting, but the organisation and what was presented to people on the stage. And yet there was a lot of talk about the issues and so on, the big one being the inheritance tax grab. But the people on the stage were all part of the uni-party, who are just as much of a problem in many ways as the Starmer regime. So, of course, the headliner they had was Camille Badenoch, the head of the fake Conservative Party.
And as well as that, there were people like Nigel Farage there, Jacob Rees-Mogg was there. I mean, they weren't speaking on the stage, but they were there making sure that people saw that they were there, being interviewed by the media and so on. And so, I mean, I think the point that David Kurten is making is a valid one. And certainly this was quite a bit of the feedback that we got from people that were not part of the farming community there, that really they need to consider, they need to really, perhaps the message that they were giving was a little bit naive. I mean, for example, everybody was holding up a placard with Starmer's name on it. And so one of the things that we would absolutely argue here is that the organisers and the people attending need to begin to understand that this is not about local domestic policy. This wasn't a Starmer decision. We've got to remember Starmer's comment from several months ago where he was asked, you know, are you for Parliament or are you for the World Economic Forum in Davos? And he said Davos every time. So we've got to remember this policy isn't coming out of Starmer's head. It's coming out of international net zero, redeploying farmland from food production into other things, and mainly landscape management and so on. And of course, the farming community are kind of stuck here in the sense that they're reliant on many of the subsidies because their business model is unfortunately based on supermarkets to such a degree, and the supermarkets have undercut them to such a degree that they're reliant on subsidy from government. And the subsidy from government is there at this point in time to reward them for landscape management and rewilding and these kinds of projects, taking them away from food production and their core values. So I think the key thing that the community, the farming community, has to recognise is that it's not domestic policy. This is international policy, and therefore, while it's always good to personalise things and Starmer's name being on the placards, fine, but we've got to recognise, they need to recognise, I would argue, who Starmer is and what he represents. And then one of the speakers, for example, was mentioning direct action. And the question then is, what kind of direct action are they going to carry out? Are they going to carry out this kind of direct action, the kind of thing that we've seen from France? Or are they going to carry out this kind of direct action also from France? So, you know, this question has to be asked. What kind of direct action are they willing to take? And what kind of direct action are they going to get support from the general public as well? And at the end of the day, of course, whatever the plight, the direct plight of farming and farmers in the country at the moment, this all comes down to us as individuals. And as Charles, the point that Charles was making last week was this one, you know, where we buy our food from. If we are buying stuff from these companies, these, you know, massive corporations that actually are producing products which I would struggle to describe as food in the first place, if this is what we personally consider to be what we want to be shoving down our throats, then we cannot expect to maintain a farming industry in this country. I don't know, Charles, if you've got any thoughts on what I've said there, or any sort of anything to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. I think the thing that I would add is really that what has characterised the nature of protests so far this year in 2024, with all the various challenges that farmers have been presented with, and this is going to sound like perhaps an unwarranted criticism, but I think is a failure to articulate exactly what it is they are hoping to achieve and setting metrics by which they know whether or not they have achieved this. And that makes it very difficult to coalesce underneath one single banner. And of course, what's happened now as a result of the budget is that the focus has been drawn towards APR and therefore the inheritance tax issue, which has the unfortunate consequence of knocking to one side all the much bigger issues that do concern exactly what you've been talking about with subsidy and in particular the skewing of the landscape by the environmental land management schemes.
One of the other comments I would make, Charles, is that in the course of speaking to people and also listening to other conversations that were going on, it was clear that there was a significant proportion of the farmers that were there that were already starting to think about how they could sell direct to the public. But of course, part of the problem that we have here is that the public, that's you and I, are used to cheap food. We have been taught to eat cheap food in the last 40, 50 years. And we perhaps prefer cheap food and going on holidays twice a year, foreign holidays. Whereas in the past, the proportion of our incomes which went on what we ate was a lot higher. Do you think that that's part of the reason that they're not getting support, is because actually people don't want to face the reality of what it actually costs to run a viable farming business?
I think that's a large part of it. I think the education is a bigger part of it, and the sort of propagandizing against the health benefits of choosing to spend more on food and getting what would be described as greater effect in terms of nutrient density. And I think that's the bit that people are not allowed to understand. And the subversion of, for example, the organic farming movement, which Julian Rose described so very well, in that in the initial stages, there was a benefit both to the environment and the consumer on a sort of health basis. But now, of course, corners can be cut, and therefore the supposed gain that one gets from something that might be labelled as organic food is perhaps not translated into the human health aspect, which makes the food effectively overpriced. But of course, that's not to say that dealing with farmers direct is not worth doing. It absolutely is. But people are not drawn towards it because of the propagandizing against it, which is controlled, of course, by the enormous corporations that you've just showed on screen.
Yes, indeed. So, well done for organising this for the organisers, but I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of working out what it is they're actually fighting and whether those were the appropriate people to have on the stage. But I just wanted to finish off with this little bit of video here and then just very briefly comment on the policing at the event.
More farmers! More free! 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 More farmers! More free!
So that happened after the main demonstration had broken up for the day, and that group of people occupied the street outside Parliament Square. The policing was very gentle, very different to what has happened at, for example, pro-Palestine demonstrations or at lockdown demonstrations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in extra as well, but very different policing at that event. And maybe we can talk in extra about why that